Hello and welcome to lesson 31 of our course here on church history, Christ Church through the ages. Today we are covering what is known as the Fourth Ecumenical Council of the Church, to us the Council of Chalcedon. And this will be part one today. What we're wanting to specifically kind of look at and cover here in our lesson is of course introductory in nature. We're wanting to get an introduction to the council itself, some of the context around what's actually being dealt with in this particular council, some of the historical background as well, just getting an elementary introduction into some of the details actually leading up into the council itself as a pretext to the council itself particularly, as well as addressing what is the central or the core issue that this particular council was actually convened for and to deal with, and that is a heresy that we call now historically Eutychianism. And so we'll be able to have an introduction to that also, so that we can get an idea of what it was that this particular teaching held, and why it was actually heretical in the first place. So much as we've done with previous councils, again, this is the introductory lesson to the council itself in part one. The next lesson, lesson 32, which will be on the Council of Chalcedon part 2, is where we'll actually specifically dive into the creed that comes out of this council, which is known eponymously as the Chalcedonian Creed. And so we'll be able to look at that in the next lesson. You'll notice on the title page of your study notes, or on screen now for those of you watching online, this particular painting that comes from later centuries. We try to incorporate various different pieces of Christian artwork into these lessons to enliven our understanding and to be able to visualize the setting that some of these things take place in. The Roman Emperor Marcion is there enthroned. You have a number of other figures, some of the key bishops involved in this particular council as well, who are portrayed there. And so this is again coming from later times concerning this particular council. So let us now move into our introduction to the Council of Chalcedon itself. The council was convened in the year AD 451 by the Roman Emperor Marcion, who was emperor at the time. The assembly itself was in session between the 8th of October and the 1st of November in that year, so a little under a month that the bishops were actually in session there. It was held in the city of Chalcedon in the region of Bithynia, of course, like the other councils, all named after the location wherein they were held, Nicaea, Constantinople and Ephesus respectively. We'll look at a map just shortly to be able to give us a bit of an idea where on earth we're talking about literally. This particular council is considered the Fourth Ecumenical Council, as I mentioned at the very top of our lesson. It's considered the Fourth Ecumenical Council in the history of the Church. We've of course covered the first three of those, namely Nicaea, Constantinople and Ephesus as mentioned. In total, this Council of Chalcedon actually had 520 bishops who were present and in attendance. And for those of you who have been with us in those previous lessons on the ecumenical councils, you'll hopefully notice immediately that this is, by quite a margin, actually makes this the largest of the ecumenical councils thus far. And in fact, it's actually the largest church council in the first 1,000 years of the church. As a result of that, there's a number of factors that are as a result of that, but one of the more helpful for us who are now here over 1,500 years later in the 21st century, who are now studying this council, is that as compared to the other councils, the Council of Chalcedon has the largest volume of writings and works that are produced and that are extant to us to this day. We know more about the Council of Chalcedon than really any other council. We obviously, not only from writings at the council itself specifically, but also writings in and around that time as well, kind of extending beyond that as a range. And so we have a great volume of work that we are able to actually look back upon and be able to understand what was going on, what was the pretext, what were the outcomes coming out of that council on the far side. And so that's a great advantage to us as we study church history. And as I mentioned earlier as well, this ultimately led to the formulation of what we call the Chalcedonian Creed, a very, very important creed in the history of the church. Of course, the Nicene Creed stands preeminent among all of the church creeds, especially from this early church period. But the Chalcedonian Creed, in terms of its immediate historical setting, actually had pretty much just as much weight, depending on, of course, on what you're talking about, but had just as much theological weight behind it in terms of its significance, to the point where now, from this period on, 451 onward, at least for the next kind of 1 to 200 years, those who are faithful to the biblical doctrines espoused and expounded here at the Council of Chalcedon, we now look back on this time period and actually refer to it as Chalcedonian Christianity, in opposition, say, for example, to those who reject the Council of Chalcedon, especially, obviously, of course, the Arians, the Gothic Arians who were flourishing at this time in the 5th and then later on into the 6th century across Europe at this time. And so that's the byproduct of the production of this Chalcedonian Creed. As I mentioned, just to give you a simplified map of these eastern portions of the empire at the time, you'll notice here what are referred to as the 5 apostolic sees from this early church period, right? So the Church of Jerusalem, Church of Antioch, Church of Alexandria, the Church of Constantinople, and the Church of Rome over there in the west. And then the remaining 2 figures here are to the church councils from the 5th century. The one, of course, the Third Ecumenical Council, the Council of Ephesus, as well as our council that we're addressing here today, which is the Council of Chalcedon. It's situated on the eastern side of the Bosphorus, right? So on the Asian side, in landmass that is today, obviously, the nation state of Turkey. This northern region of Anatolia is referred to as Bithynia and Pontus historically, as was touched on earlier. So that's where Chalcedon, the city itself, is specifically. You can, of course, notice how close it is in proximity to Constantinople. That's not, I would suggest, by coincidence. Of course, Constantinople is the heart of the empire in these days. Rome, as in the original Rome, old Rome, carries, of course, no shortage of significance from a historical perspective, but Constantinople is the civic center of the empire. It's the administrative center of the empire. Of course, the imperial court itself is located in Constantinople. And so the proximity and the selection of Chalcedon itself in particular shows how close this particular issue was to the kind of epicenter of the civic and religious and administrative life of the empire itself. So to continue on in our introduction, the Council of Chalcedon's primary purpose was to reaffirm and to clarify 4 particular historical documents. Now, we're obviously not going to cover those in terms of the substance of detail. That would take us many, many lessons. But we are referencing them here just so at least you have an idea of what they were, and B, as a reference to then be able to go and look them up and to study them yourself if you so choose. Those 4 documents in particular are as follows. The Creed of Nicaea, right, i.e. the original Nicene Creed from the Council of Nicaea in AD 325. Secondly, the Creed of Constantinople, i.e. the updated, what we might call today, the updated Nicene Creed from the Council of Constantinople in AD 381. This is the updated version that then everyone, apart from the Filioque controversy, but that's another lesson for a later time. That is the basic standard formulation of the Nicene Creed that has now been in use for over 1,600 years in the church. That is the basis upon which all Christians are called to, as it expounds the fundamental doctrines of the church from Scripture. Thirdly, the letters of Cyril of Alexandria, who was a prominent figure in the Council of Ephesus and in the interluding time between the councils of Ephesus and the Council of Chalcedon. He writes a number of letters addressing the Nestorian heresy, which we touched on in those previous lessons on the Council of Ephesus. And so his letters were being worked through here, as well as, fourth and finally, what we simply refer to in historical terms as the Tome of Pope Leo I. Leo I was the Bishop of Rome at this particular time. He writes a tome, in other words, a book or a scroll, a theological work addressing the issues of Nestorianism, Eutychianism, and other such things. Leo I was a staunch and valiant defender of the biblical doctrine of Christology, of the person and work of Christ himself, as well as the Trinity more broadly. Leo I is one of the great bishops of Rome, alongside other figures like Gregory the Great, of course, who comes about 150 years after this time, nearly. And so he's a significant factor. He wasn't present physically himself. The Roman bishops rarely ever were at these kinds of councils in the East. Instead, they sent legates or representatives. But his work obviously was one of the central, became one of the central figures kind of vicariously as a result of that. So let us now continue here with a bit more of the background on this particular council itself, kind of the details leading into it. Following the passing of Cyril of Alexandria, so we mentioned him, obviously part of his letters, a number of his letters were ones that were being considered. He featured in the Council of Ephesus rather centrally. He then passes away in AD 444. Obviously his influence extends all the way up to the council itself, kind of from beyond the grave, proverbially, through his letters. But following his passing in AD 444, Nestorianism kind of comes back with a bit of a vengeance. There is, as I say, a burgeoning revival of Nestorianism, certainly around Constantinople and some of the areas in the east. During this particular time, an elderly monk, or by then an elderly monk from Constantinople named Evtychos, right, or Eutyches, as we now call him in English, started to teach a variation of the historic Christology in order to try and combat it. I'll make more of this point kind of when we get later on in the lesson. But he is, and just so you understand, Eutyches is coming from the perspective of anti-Nestorianism. He's not a Nestorian himself. He is seeking to combat Nestorianism. He already had been in times past, but now, especially with this revival that kind of Nestorianism that had come about as a result of the passing of Cyril of Alexandria, who was obviously a stalwart defender of the of those doctrines back at the Council of Ephesus. Eutyches now steps into the fray to try and defend against it. As I mentioned, they're in stark opposition to the radical diophysitism of Nestorianism, as previously covered. Eutyches instead formulates his own interpretation of Cyril of Alexandria's teachings and works that he had actually worked on, and that was particularly and especially centered around a phrase or a line that comes from one of his letters, which is as follows. In English, one physis of God, the Logos incarnate. Okay. Now, in previous lessons, we have referenced a number of these words. Of course, even if you consider all three of our portions on the various ecumenical councils thus far, we've seen a number of these Greek words that were being employed. Of course, Greek being the common language at the time in the empire. Words like hypostasis, right, or where we get that term hypostatic union from. This is one of those other such words, the word physis. Obviously, you can probably notice the etymology there for the words like physical that we have in English today, or physicality. One physis of God, the Logos incarnate. Now, honing into that word physis again, we're going to touch on what Cyril of Alexandria himself actually specifically means, right? To get a bit of an idea, let's just kind of touch on that first. From the broader context of Cyril's writings itself, it appears, and this is, again, I'm trying to put this in the most generous, gracious light as we kind of are looking back on this issue nearly 1600 years ago. It appears from the broader context of his writings that Cyril seemed to be potentially under the impression that the Greek word physis in Greek meant what the Latin word persona, right, from where we get the word personal from, for example, that those two words were equivalent or synonymous. Okay, the way he uses the word, the Greek word physis, he uses it as an equivalent and synonymous term with the Latin word persona. That appears to be the impression that he's under. Again, we're trying not to be hypercritical. We're trying to put this in a reasonable balance as we're sitting here, like I said, nearly 1600 years later, looking back on these facts and looking back on these details. If that's the case, if he is under the impression as a Greek speaker, not a Latin speaker, that the Greek term physis, which means nature, okay, it has a broader semantic range than that as well, but it primarily at its root means nature, what we would now call nature. If he's under the impression that the Greek term physis is equivalent or synonymous to the Latin term persona, he would be mistaken, okay? And it appears that that's what's going on, okay? The Greek term physis, just to give you an understanding, is much more approximate to the Latin word natura, right? Which is where we get the word nature from, okay? Hence why I said persona meaning nature, right? Natura in Latin, okay? Consequently, and again, this is the most beneficial good faith reading of Cyril, of the broader context, not just that one line, but the whole kind of counsel of Cyril's work. What it appears that Cyril of Alexandria was in fact actually attempting to communicate would have been what would have more properly worded as the following. One hypostasis of God, the Logos incarnate. Okay? So the difference between those two is that in his writings, he uses the word physis, right? One physis, one nature of God the Logos incarnate is what it would be literally saying. From the broader context of how he talks about this subject in his writings, it much more reasonably appears that the word he probably should have actually been using was one hypostasis of God the Logos incarnate. And again, we've touched on that word hypostasis. It had a meaning going back centuries and centuries and centuries in Hellenistic history, right, and the history of the Greek language. In the church, however, especially through not only the Council of Nicaea, but especially the Council of Chalcedon, the Council of Constantinople, so the first two ecumenical councils, Nicaea and Constantinople, that term in ecclesiastical usage, hypostasis, essentially means what we would now call person, okay? It's why we then say this term of the hypostatic union. Again, I'm referring to it in simplified terms, of course, for the sake of time, but we refer to it using this fairly simple formulaic understanding of two natures of Christ, right? The divine and the human, right? Fully God, fully man, united in one hypostasis, right? United in one person, okay? The broader context of Cyril's writings, I would argue, and many other theologians and historians have argued this too, would rather clearly indicate that the word he really should have been using here was hypostasis, and it appears that he's under the misunderstanding that the Greek term physis is equivalent to that Latin term persona, when in reality it's actually more equivalent to the Latin term natura, right, or nature, okay? This establishes and sets up, though, the very heart of the problem, because as we're about to find out here in our brief introduction into Eutychianism, Eutyches takes this literal wording that Cyril of Alexandria unfortunately was using, and not only runs with it, but in fact doubles down upon it. And you're going to see how that kind of plays out here for us. So let's move on to our, again, brief introduction into the groundwork or the foundation of what we now call the heresy of Eutychianism itself. In radical distinction to the Nestorian claim that the two natures of Christ constitute two persons, again, covered that during Nestorianism itself in previous lessons. So the two natures of Christ, the divine and the human, constituted two persons, a divine person and a human person. That's what Nestorianism certainly the followers of Nestorius and the system that we now call Nestorianism taught slash teaches, right? In distinction to that, in fact, radical distinction to that, Eutyches himself had inverted the assertion to the very opposite extreme, namely that the human nature and the divine nature were combined, again, more on that word later on, were combined into a single nature of Christ without any alteration, absorption, or confusion, that of the incarnate word, right? So taking upon that phraseology of Cyril, one physis of God, the Logos incarnate. Okay, so the Logos of the Christ, the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity. One physis, one, what in reality would mean one nature of God, the Logos incarnate. Okay. Now, granted, here in in the writings that come from Eutyches and those who then end up kind of upholding that view, they do make point of kind of the latter portion of that sentence there, without any alteration, absorption, or confusion. You'll see just shortly that that's not quite the case, especially when you get into the next lesson on the actual Chalcedonian Creed itself specifically. We'll kind of really unpack that. But nevertheless, in this context here, many of the Chalcedonian bishops, so the bishops actually present at the council, were greatly concerned that that this amounted to what was known as Docetism. We haven't covered that specifically, but it's very akin to this. What you essentially have is the polar opposite of Nestorianism. Nestorianism radically separates the two natures and actually produces or teaches and upholds two different persons, right? What I kind of was colloquially referring to in those lessons as schizophrenic Jesus, right? In this case, it's the very opposite. It's the two natures actually being combined into one single nature. Not just two natures united in one person, which is the biblical orthodox position. The two natures themselves actually combine to become a new singular nature, right? Equally heretical, equally problematic, just at the very opposite end of the spectrum of Nestorianism itself. And so, although this kind of partly aligned with the later teaching of Cyril of Alexandria, especially with that unfortunate wording of one physis of God the Logos incarnate, but again, we touched on the explanation there, Eutyches was nevertheless accused of having gone beyond Cyril, and he definitely went far beyond Cyril, by denying that Christ was, quote, consubstantial with us men, which is that phrase that comes from the Nicene Creed, okay? Consubstantial with us men, right? In other words, of the same substance, okay, with us men, right? He's fully God and he's fully man, right? It denied the uniqueness of his divinity. It then denied the veracity of his humanity, and creates a multitude of problems, which we'll then primarily cover next lesson when we then actually see how they formulate this concept in the Chalcedonian Creed itself. Nevertheless, some historians have argued that he did not actually intend to kind of deny Christ's humanity, and there is an argument that can be made for that in terms of his intention, and rather this was done to kind of stress the uniqueness of Christ. That argument can be made. The primary issue, however, is that this formulation of Christology that Eutyches produced nevertheless did in fact actually constitute a confusion of the natures, which is of course absolutely heretical. From a historical perspective, you can make a reasonable argument or to distinguish between the intention of Eutychianism, right, or at least specifically addressing the man, the intentions of Eutyches himself, and the consequences of his writings. You can make a reasonable distinction between those two things. But as, of course, the old saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The intentions are one thing. The consequences are another matter entirely. And we're going to kind of see that unfold, as I mentioned, particularly in the next lesson on the Chalcedonian Creed itself. So, to give you a graphic, again, this is also in your study notes. We've seen graphics like this in times past with regards to Nestorianism. You'll see how it's actually the very opposite, as we've kind of been pointing out. here in this graph, to give you a visual understanding, the human nature and the divine nature are then combined into a new, distinct, unique nature, not two natures, right? The two natures actually now you combine and are confused, again, that word will become important in the next lesson, into one new, distinct, unique nature, right? Within the one person. So he upholds that there's one person of Christ. Okay, so that's obviously in contradistinction to Nestorianism, and obviously the orthodox biblical diophysite position is that there is indeed two physis, right? Hence dio, two natures, but they are united in a hypostatic union, one person. Okay, this upholds the element of the one hypostasis, the one person. However, it is what we would call monophysite, okay, one nature. So just as on one end of the spectrum, radical diophysitism of Nestorianism is heresy, this is the polar opposite end of the spectrum. This is monophysitism, monos, the only nature, okay, or less literally the one nature, right? Monos, the only nature. Two original natures, human and divine, but now have been combined, mingled, confused into one new nature. It's essentially, to kind of put it in analogous terms, taking two original ingredients, mixing them in a pan into a new substance. Okay, it's no longer, say if you're baking a cake, it's no longer just simply flour, it's no longer just simply sugar, it's no longer just simply chocolate or whatever the ingredients happen to be. It's now its own new thing. Of course, the constituent elements are there, they're present in a certain way, but it's no longer just those things. They've actually been confused. You can no longer just simply point to the flour, or simply to the sugar, or simply to the chocolate, or simply to whatever happens to be that you're actually using in baking this particular item. They've been mingled, they've been confused. Again, there's other words which will become apparent, like I said earlier. A brand new nature, what we call in theological terms monophysitism. Right? It's important that you remember this. Again, this is just an introductory lesson, but it's to guide us into our next particular lesson. So, to summarize some of our points here, Eutychianism itself is the central or the fundamental issue that is at hand for us in regards to this Council of Chalcedon in AD 451. The works of Cyril of Alexandria, as you can well tell, surpass their significance surpasses even his natural life, as he passes away in AD 444, as we covered. But his works end up making him, from beyond the grave almost, a central figure of this particular council. And along with those other works of course, the tome of Pope Leo I and the creeds coming out of the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople, respectively. They are not just simply dealing with these issues in a vacuum. They are dealing them in a very real, tangible, earthy context in history. These are very much live issues in their day. These are the big ticket issues that they have to deal with. And by virtue of them not occurring in a vacuum, it's why they're referring back to those previous ecumenical councils and those creeds. You can already see, and especially as we then get to the Chalcedonian Creed, you'll get a fuller picture of how important those creeds already are at this time in history, and that they haven't, they're not just simply tidbits of documents that kind of were written and then shoved away in a shelf somewhere. They're actually present, and they're active in that kind of sense in the ecclesiastical sphere, as well as even more broadly. And so they are building upon history. They are honouring the work of those who have come before them through the previous ecumenical councils, and what you're hopefully starting to see okay, especially with kind of the relations back to Nestorianism, is that much like the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople acted as kind of part one and part two, right? The Council of Constantinople, the Second Ecumenical Council, was really like a part two of that first and previous council. In this context, now in the 5th century AD, these councils, namely the third and the fourth, i.e., the councils of Ephesus and the councils of Chalcedon, are also functioning as kind of a round one and round two of this particular issue. That's often how history goes. Of course, the two world wars, World War One and World War Two, have that same relationship. Apart from certain figures changing sides, like the Italians, for example, World War Two was essentially round two of World War One. It was the follow-up war that broke out as a result or a confluence of the events that took place not only during World War One, but indeed in the aftermath of World War One. This is the same case here. The Council of Chalcedon is very much dealing with issues that stem all the way back to the Council of Ephesus 20 years prior to itself. And this is how history unfolds. It's rarely ever in history that issues are just simply dealt with as kind of a one and done issue. Largely by virtue of the fact that that's not how human beings work. The declarations coming out of the Council of Nicaea, when it was addressing Arianism specifically, didn't just magically make all the Arians convert to biblical orthodoxy, nor did it make them just magically put down their proverbial swords and stop their fight in defense and in support of Arianism. No, the issue had to be kind of dealt with once and for all. So you lay the foundation at Nicaea, and then you put the nail in the coffin at Constantinople. Similarly and likewise, you lay the foundation at Ephesus, slight variance in this case, because Eutychianism is actually trying to deal with Nestorianism. Eutychia's pendulum swings into heresy in the opposite direction. And so the Council of Chalcedon kind of becomes a fix-all nail in the coffin, where it deals not only with Nestorianism again, but also deals with its polar opposite, monophysitism, right? aka Eutychianism, or at least this particular form of monophysitism, namely Eutychianism. And so that's what we're going to see, that nail in the coffin is what we now call the Chalcedonian Creed, or the Creed of Chalcedon. A very, very important creed, especially with regards to Christology itself. Okay, so therein ends Lesson 31 on the Council of Chalcedon, Part 1.